As we answer the 911 call and we see the police car and we see the ambulance that has decided that it's going to roll up, we get to the point.
The Associated Press investigated over 1,000 cases of unintentionally fatal interventions by police between 2012 and 2021 and found that sedative administration took place prior to 94 of those deaths, nearly 10% of non-firearm police subdued deaths in that time period. AP's investigation discovered a disproportionate impact on Black individuals, with administering providers as well as medical examiners citing excited delirium as the reason for administration and as the cause of death after the fact, a diagnosis that is starting to come under contest by medical experts. The article also points to the lack of scrutiny when sedatives are administered prior to police-involved civilian deaths, where focus remains on police actions rather than on medical interventions. This story is from AP News by Ryan J. Foley, Carla K. Johnson, and Shelby Lum on April 26, 2024.
It's
Yeah.
difficult reading this article. It was difficult reading.
It was, yeah. And I took a special interest in this one because I worked in EMS before. I used to be an EMT. And it talked a lot about police directing the administration of sedatives, and especially ketamine, or just controlled narcotics in general. And I don't ever remember, working with a law enforcement officer that would ever have dictated how a medic should provide care to a patient, or a medic that would have listened. So a lot of this was really shocking for me to read and learn about.
Eli, if I can jump in for a sec. So if I read this, just to get to the heart of the article, basically when police are arresting an individual and the individual is not complying, what I understand here is that the police are using drugs to sedate the person to make it easier to control them. Does that sound about right?
That's how I understood it, but it was the narcotics administered by the EMS, the paramedics that show up on scene. Is how, at least because at least in the areas where I've worked, there was no police agencies that have been trained in narcotic administration and all. That's purely a paramedic thing. EMTs don't do that. That's paramedics. So, there's advanced EMTs, but by and large, so to speak. So that's sort of where it's coming from. So it was the paramedic aspect of it that I really sort of took a special interest in. But I have so much I could say about this. Phoebe, what do you?
It reminds me, not police, administering these drugs and stuff, but it reminds me of a case that came out of Utah, where a woman was a nurse refused police access to a patient who had been involved in a car accident. A police officer walked in and said, "I have to take a blood sample." Said, "I must take a blood sample. I must take a blood sample." Went, "Nope, you have to get a warrant." And he went, "No, I must take a blood sample." And it escalated and escalated. She refused. And she got arrested by him because the police officer believed he was above the law, believed what he said went. And that seems very much the case here. The police officer feels, I'm above the law. The law doesn't apply to me. And that's why there are so many things wrong with the police situation in the United States. First one, as a legally trained person, is qualified immunity. Qualified immunity means that police officers think they have an unmitigated, unfettered right to make up the law and behave like bullies. Second one is...
So I suppose a sense of pragmatism, would it be, Phoebe?
Well, yeah. It's a sense of superiority almost. I have qualified immunity because I'm a police officer. I can do as I please because I'm a police officer. They need taking down a peg or two. And the problem is, and I wouldn't normally say this, is that their trade union is the problem. The Fraternal Order of Police is the problem because they stop accountability of the police, they threaten lawsuits, and they reduce the training that goes on. And it just lead to situations where things of this nature go on and on and on, and everyone gets angry when it happens, but nothing ever changes. Rodney King happened. George Floyd happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Scott, you have lived through these things in America. Not you personally, but you've lived through these events occurring.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a shock to you to read this?
You know, it's in one respect, it is a shock. It's a shocking story. It's shocking in that it's painful and frightening and angering and sad that this kind of thing is happening. It's not It's not surprising. It's not unexpected. In fact, as the math guy here, I felt like obligated to look up some stats here. So I looked up police killings. Okay. And so I found Prison Policy Initiative. They gathered data from 10 wealthy countries: Australia, Canada, England, Germany, Iceland, Japan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and the US. And in 2019, US police killed 1,099 civilians. In second place was Canada with 36. Okay, so clearly there's something happening here in the United States that's different than the rest of the world. In addition to that, in a different study, I saw that the rate is increasing. Between 2013 and 2023, the number of police killings in a year went from 1,079 in 2013 to 1,352 in 2023. That's a 25% increase in 10 years. So I think what we can learn here is that there's something fundamentally different in the way that the police in the United States interact with the public when we're comparing to other wealthy countries. And so on one hand, we could say that there's some bad apples out there, and I'm sure that's the case. But I think the data shows that the problem is systemic. And in order to solve a systemic problem, we're going to need a systemic solution. Now, what that solution is, you know, I think that's up for debate. But it's clearly something is different in the United States than elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Phoebe.
In Britain, we have non-lethal ways of dealing with this. So when somebody is, acting violently, they are restrained with certain things. So they'll have, their legs will be bound together, they'll be handcuffed. If they're spitting, they'll have a spit hood. You won't reach in Britain for the nearest bottle of ketamine to go, whoosh.
Yeah.
I mean, what are doctors and police officers and medics doing here? Injecting people with random medication, randomly injecting medication into people that you don't know what reaction is going to happen, and you could be killing somebody with an allergic reaction to that. I mean, I can't speak for America. I definitely can't speak for Australia, but that does seem like something that you shouldn't be doing, Damien.
Yeah. Police, some police in some jurisdictions seem very punitive to, willing to sedate people who are in reality posing no threat, especially when they're already restrained. And I think the George Floyd footage is a good example of that. And just listening to this, relating back to the Australian experience, and in particular the state of Victoria, back in the 80s and 90s in the state of Victoria, the armed robbery squad of the Victoria Police were very much shoot first, ask questions later, and that's if the guy survived. And basically what then happened was that the crooks basically ambushed police and started killing police back in revenge. And so it became this like tit for tat, where, there were dead bodies, broken families, all this kind of stuff in the name of justice, in the name of catching the crooks. And I think there has to be a line where, you shouldn't have to break the law to enforce the law.
I mean, due process in America.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of... And the problem is that if you're killing or injuring the person you're trying to arrest, especially especially if they die, then, you've removed their chance of natural justice. If your, negligent actions in either administering ketamine or, resting on someone's neck or whatever has caused them to not be able to defend themselves in front of the law, then, you've removed the dignity of the person, but also denied their chance of natural justice. And which is like, thanks, guys.
The thing to remember here is what if the tables were turned? What if the police officer that administered this drug one day was having it administered to them, Eli?
Yeah, so there definitely is a lot of questions around consent when it comes to this. Obviously, all medical treatments require consent, and there's different aspects that come into play when you have like an unconscious person or a person who isn't capable, alert and oriented to make their own decisions and things like that. But I remember watching the video and thinking, so Demetrio Jackson was the name of one of the individuals that they really focused on in the article, and they had a video about him. And I remember watching the moment where they administered the ketamine to him. And ketamine, by the way, isn't classified as a sedative drug. It's a dissociative anesthetic, and what it essentially does is stops responsive nerves essentially from reacting to stimuli. So things like when your body doesn't realize that it has too much carbon dioxide inside it, it doesn't engage that breathing mechanism to breathe off that carbon dioxide, which is what it seems like happened with Demetrio Jackson, unless I'm misunderstanding it, which is a possibility. But when these things are happening, and in the moment that he got that shot, it did not seem like he was being combative. He did not need to be, sedated. They use these narcotics or these drugs as what they call chemical restraints. And it just didn't seem like he needed to be restrained any further. And the other medical experts in the video that they interviewed seemed to have the same opinion. So there really is a huge question about like the consent issue. He was alert and oriented to make his own decisions and did not consent, nor did he need that drug for his or anybody else's safety. So that probably came largely into play during the court case for those EMS professionals.
Because we talk here about medical consent here, but the other thing that we have to take into consideration here is that, particularly in focus on this panel, is that some individuals being injected with this is actually a violation of their religious rights. So say, for example, if you were to have a Mormon that was injected with these drugs, that could very easily be a violation of their religious rights. And other things that could happen. So you could have a Jehovah's Witness that is injected with this and they abstain from all these drugs, abstain from medical treatment, and you just decide you're going to inject them. You're violating their religious rights, aren't you, Scott?
In one respect, yes. Religious rights don't trump the law and public safety.
But the freedom of religion is guaranteed by the First Amendment, though.
Pardon?
But the freedom of religion and the exercise thereof of your religion is guaranteed by the First Amendment. So if you've got no consent here to have these chemicals put into your body.
Mm-hmm. Right, but the First Amendment doesn't, like I said, it doesn't. I mean, if you if you have a firmly held religious belief that you're allowed to take whatever you want from anybody, that doesn't mean you can, and the police can stop you. The police are allowed to do things that the general population are not. They're allowed to put you in handcuffs against your consent. They're allowed to put you in a car and take you away and lock you in a room. And if I did that to somebody, I'd be arrested for kidnapping. And so. So I think consent is certainly part of the equation here. However, we need to, it needs to be reasonable what the police are doing. I think that there are cases where administering a sedative, or Eli, what was the phrase that you used for ketamine? It was not a sedative.
Dissociative anesthetic.
Dissociative anesthetic. I mean, basically a drug that will calm you down or stop you from reacting violently. an argument can be made that there would be cases where that is in the best interest of the individual and in the best interest of the public. And the problem that really stuck out to me in this particular article was that the medical professionals were not being listened to. The police were pressuring the EMTs to administer the drug. They were, against their best medical judgment, and so that, I think, is part of the issue. It's yes, I agree that that a person's religious rights need to be weighed. A person's individual consent needs to be weighed. Part of that, though, is the safety of the individual. Part of that is the safety of the public at large. But the police that are untrained shouldn't be making this decision.
I just have to stop you there.
Okay.
The thing here, though, is why is it so prevalent? Why is it that the first thing that the police officer is doing is grabbing that vial and going thump? Why is that happening so frequently when I cannot see analogous things happen in any European country, in any Oceania country, in Canada? Why is America reaching for the drugs before it goes through every other step? Britain has violent individuals. It doesn't have police officers reaching for glass vials and hypodermic needles, and police officers aren't getting killed by violent individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So why are America reaching for that glass vial first?
Well, because our police aren't trained about proper use of restraint and proper use of control, and it's the easy way out. Take, for example, now this example is definitely on a different plane when it comes to seriousness here, but I think there's a kernel of similarity between the situation we're talking about here and young parents with children that are just infants that are just crying and they won't calm down. I have two kids myself. I've been in that situation, and you feel, especially with your first child, you feel a sense of panic. You feel a sense of wanting to do something. You feel a sense of what can I do to fix this problem now? And so there can be a strong temptation to maybe give your child Benadryl, for example. Okay, it has a side effect of making the person who takes it sleepy, right? And so if we compare. Now, my wife and we tried not to do that, but I have to admit that there were some cases where we were a little bit generous with the directions, a little bit generous with the symptoms that are you sure that's not a cold? Are you sure that? I think that looks like an allergic reaction to me. Maybe we should give, and so I can understand the temptation there to want to do something, want to take what we could argue are very extreme response. Now, compare that to when my second child, and I was much more experienced. I knew what the normal behavior of an infant was. I knew things that were effective. I knew I had a new sense of patience. I had a new sense of confidence as a parent, and I think that underlines what I was talking about before about the training of the police officers. It's a naive, lazy response. Okay. And when I was first a parent, I was a naive and lazy parent. I became better at it as I got more experience and as I learned more. And I think that same kind of thing can be applied here. We need to, train police to respond appropriately and to listen to medical professionals when necessary. And so, And the law, I think, has to step in and nail it down in order for those kind of decisions to be made.
I mean, Damien, you brought up Victoria Police in Australia. Were the police held to a higher standard because they were the police when they were engaged in what is effectively shoot first?
Yeah, well, look, eventually the reason why the death rate for Victoria Police came about was because two junior constables were ambushed by criminals. And in the inquest that happened after that, it was discovered that the Victoria Police had a shoot first mentality. And so when they revisited, like, how can we do this better? They realized that, basically Victoria Police were essentially criminals in blue uniforms, crooks in blue uniforms trying to catch other crooks. Was essentially how it was. So then they underwent a cultural shift where it was about training. It was about, learning how to effectively restrain people, and, ensuring that they're alive as far as can be after a police interaction, to the point where a few years ago, there was a bank robber who was on the run. And so he was holed up in a particular house, and he was shot by beanbag bullets. And the story goes was that when he was arrested, he asked if he could keep the beanbag round that knocked him out. And the police said no, unfortunately. It was something like that. So we've actually kind of undergone a shift where, like, shooting is like the last thing. We use tasers, we use capsicum spray, we use other things. This isn't to say that we've got it right, but I would much rather be arrested by Victoria Police than, let's say, Michigan or Utah Police.
And if you have comments on which police force you'd prefer to be arrested by, please leave them in the comments below.